Hello, everyone, and welcome to this program here at the Learning Center of Senior Citizens Incorporated. I'm Roger Smith, Director of the Learning Center, and it is wonderful to see all of you here in person for this special program, which I will announce in just a second or two. But I want to add a welcome as well to those folks who will be viewing the program in its virtual form. There's never quite any substitute for having you with us here in person, but we're glad that you can still avail yourselves of the program even remotely and even vicariously. So welcome, one and all. As those of you who have been with us over the past 8 weeks will already know, we here at TLC have joined forces with a statewide organization called Georgia Women of Achievement. And in this season, we have held up for closer examination and study and understanding a number of women across a number of corners of Georgia, across a number of centuries, and with each her own different set of achievements and accomplishments that are worth our study and worth our attention. The season technically ended just a couple of days ago, but even though we here at TLC pride ourselves on great advanced planning and a catalog of programs that can be relied on to happen when they're supposed to happen, we never want to be unalive to targets of opportunity. And when those opportunities come along, when the stars align just so, we're very happy to try to take advantage of them. And in the case of today, that is absolutely what's going on. We have with us today Velma Fan, who's visiting from the Atlanta area. For more than 20 years, she has made it her business to research and find out information and kind of resurrect the life and achievements of a woman from right here in Savannah, born in the 1870s. Her name is Mamie George Williams. She may be somewhat of an unfamiliar name to most people who live in Savannah, even though she is from right here among us. She's an African-American historic figure who was born just as Jim Crow was gearing up, yet at the point of women's suffrage in 1920, the 19th Amendment, she worked tirelessly to register African-American women primarily at a moment in Georgia history when that was not the easiest or even the safest thing to be doing. Just yesterday, Velma was here in town for a wonderful historical marker dedication. The Georgia Historical Society worked with other local bodies to create this historical marker. I was in attendance. It was a fabulous event. And we now have this historical marker on Henry Street just across from the Carnegie Library. So I would encourage each of you to go pay a visit to that historical marker, read the text, and with Velma's help, you're going to have all kinds of background and all kinds of context that will make that historical marker text make more sense. Velma has spent a great deal of her adult life researching and writing about African-American history, and I'm so glad that her attention included attention to Mamie George Williams from right here in Savannah. So I know that you'll all want to join me in giving Velma Fan a very warm Learning Center welcome.
Thank you. And good morning.
Good morning.
I appreciate everyone coming out so early to hear about this. Thank you very, very much. Mamie George Williams. She found me. I didn't find her. I wasn't even looking for her. I was in the library doing some research on a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Davis. And he was a committee member, an Odd Fellows, an African American, and a community builder. He was also into politics, and he had a newspaper called the Atlanta Independent. And so I'm reading through the Atlanta Independent, and I'm reading about him because it was always all about him. No matter what it was about him. And there was this woman who was just a thorn in his side, this Mamie George Williams. And I'm thinking, I'm going to come back to you. I'm researching him, but I'm going to come back to you. And so once I completed my research on him, I started to go back through the papers to say, so who is this woman that's just aggravating him? She was a woman who would not be quiet. She was a woman in politics, and she became an adversary. A friendly adversary, but an adversary. So the more I researched and the more I learned, the more I said, wow, we need to know more about Mamie George Williams. Mamie George Williams was a towering figure and noted civic and political leader in the early 20th century. A native and lifelong resident of Savannah, she held leadership positions in local and national women's clubs, served as a member of the Interracial Commission of Georgia, rose to become Georgia's ranking member of the Republican Party, and established a school and a home for African American girls. To many, Williams was the Esther of her people, a woman who stood violently before the ruling powers of her day. Williams called out political traitors, advanced causes, marked victories, and yes, bore defeat. Today, few people speak her name, but for a time, Mamie Williams stood tall among African American leaders, determined to extract from the smudge of politics, she said, everything of value out of it for her race. So one could say that Mamie was born a privilege, as much as African Americans could be a privilege just a few years outside of the Civil War. She was born to James and Sarah Miller, religious leaders in Savannah, and she was given the name Mary Frances, but she was always called Mamie. She completed her early education, and she also was a graduate of the Atlanta University. Thus, she was what we call educated and refined. She married George S. Williams, a noted educator and businessman here in Savannah, who died in 1915. So throughout her early years, she was known as Mamie George S. Williams, later being recognized in her own right as Mrs. Mamie Williams, and to her closest friends, Mamie George. So Williams believed in civic engagement, perhaps a value instilled in her by her parents or at the Atlanta University Center. And this is where I first found her. Williams demonstrated her patriotism, supporting liberally loaned drives which provided crucial and emotional support for Black troops engaged in the war camp. She gave 2,400 hours of volunteer work. I said 2,400 hours of volunteer work with the Toussaint L'Ouverture branch of the American Red Cross, and that earned her a coveted pen. She was a fair-complexioned woman with auburn hair, and she appeared white to some, drawing some raised eyebrows at a meeting of African-American women. A woman of independent means, she owned a home in Savannah and property, and was known to motor, they said, to Long Island, New York, to her second home. Social service and politics were her life's calling, and she would make a profound impact in both. The year was 1920. It was historic as 36 states had ratified the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Can we get an applause for that? So she rolled up her sleeves with an unmatched zeal and set out to register women in Georgia, particularly African American women. According to one newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, Ms. Williams registered, quote, so many colored women in Georgia that the governor of the state stopped registration for all women. I like that. She joined the Women's Suffrage Club of Chatham County, serving as one of its executive members. The club held forums at local churches, invited political leaders to speak to women of the process of voting, took a census of every woman of voting age, and held mock elections. So that's grassroots activities. Concerned with the general well-being of African Americans, the Suffrage Club promoted literacy by establishing night schools for adults. From 1920 to 1924, Williams was chairwoman of the Committee of Citizenship of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She was there to increase its membership and voting. Among her contemporaries, Mary Church Terrell, activist and first president of the association, Ida B. Wells, fiery journalist and anti-lynching crusader, Maggie Lena Walker, first woman of any race to charter a bank, and Mary McLeod Bethune, founder of Dayton Normal and Industrial Institute, later named Bethune-Cookman College. In fact, Williams is pictured standing next to Mary McLeod Bethune in a 1936 photo of women. So she was well connected. Active in voter registrations and education, Mamie George Williams rose through Georgia's Republican ranks. She, as did thousands of other African Americans, voted the Republican ticket because that was the party that freed the enslaved. She was mentored by Henry Lincoln Link Johnson, a revered National Republican committeeman from Georgia. Johnson's brilliant arguments against the lily-white Republicans who vowed to unseat Black Republican leaders were legendary. She met and at times bittered differently with Benjamin Davis, the gentleman I mentioned, Georgia National Committeeman, an editor and shrewd political leader. She supported the party and is said to have brought out 40,000 Georgia women to vote in the 1920 presidential election, waging voters' campaigns in what was then 160 Georgia counties from her headquarters in Atlanta. And I thought, how does she do it? How did you do that today? Just spread out, just everybody spread out and register women to vote. She was rewarded for her dedication and hard work. In 1924, the Republican Party adopted what it called the 50-50 rule, stipulating that women must comprise 50% of the Republican National Committee. So with this 50-50 rule, Henry Link Johnson seized this opportunity to place a black woman in this position. He appointed Mamie Williams committee woman for Georgia. And that year, 1924, Mamie Williams became the first woman from Georgia and the first African-American woman in the country to serve on the Republican National Committee. Oh, the Negro press was just applauding her. Georgia woman associate member of the National Committee, Miss George W. Williams, to sit on the National Committee of her party. The Chicago Defender recorded, "Our leader selected GOP ranks, Mrs. George S. Williams wins highest honors." So she went on to pursue this and to hold that very special position. And people would say, wow, wasn't that great? Wasn't that enough? But Mamie wasn't finished. God had another plan for her. At that convention, she scored another first. She became the first woman in U.S. political history granted the floor at the Republican National Convention. And I had to stop and think about that. And I said, something like that happened with Fannie Lou Hamer. She wanted to speak from that convention in '64 at Chicago. And then President Johnson kind of interrupted. So they couldn't hear that live speech of her saying, this is what's happening in Mississippi, and this is why we need to have a representative delegation here. But Mamie struck that as a first. Well, there's another first. Immediately after the 1924 convention, Williams again made history. She convened with other prominent women and established the National Republican League of Colored Women, the first and only national political organization among African-American women in the United States. Now, as an aside, I come from the Baptist church tradition, and we talk back to speakers. So we're going to say, you go, Miss Mamie.
You go, Miss Mamie.
You go, Miss Mamie.
You go, Miss
There
Mamie.
you go. Politics again would engulf Miss Mamie. In 1925, upon the death of her mentor, Link Johnson, she became the highest-ranking African-American Republican in Georgia. She singularly held the reign of power until 1926, when old Benjamin Davis was named to replace Johnson. She rose to power during the years of the Hoover administration, a time when black Republicans were fighting for their political lives. The administration would be remembered as one that stripped black Republicans of power, ridding the power of what they called corrupt black and tan leaders so that the party would appeal to white voters. So this was what the Republican Party was trying to do. So, okay, so the Democrats ruled the South, and they wanted to bring white people into the Republican Party. So they said the best way to do that is to get rid of the African Americans. And so this was something that had started years before, but really picked up speed under this particular administration. So Williams juggled an on-again, off-again relationship with candidate and later President Herbert Hoover. She appeared to be his confidant. So in 1928, during a stop in Savannah, then presidential candidate Hoover sought out Williams, sought out this black woman, sought out this colored woman, inviting her as a guest in his private car. Did you ever hear about that? It was a gesture to win her confidence and support and to woo Negro leaders. Yet the Republican Party began to show its contempt for black leaders. After Hoover gained nomination, the Republican Party accelerated what it called its whitewashing of the party. Hoover was disturbed by reports that black and tan leaders were selling federal appointments. That is, giving your friends political jobs. And he said, people have been doing this since the beginning of dawn, beginning of politics. So why now is it a problem? Despite some reservations of Hoover, Williams and other committee members supported him and decided to go ahead and give him the party's election. And so during the inaugural, he thanked everybody. Leading black Republicans, including Williams, poured into the inaugural galas at the White Now, I had never heard about this. We're talking 1928, a delegation of African Americans at the White House. It's hard for us to get in there now. It is difficult to say, oh, and this is how the reporter wrote about it, and this is our column. It is difficult to say when Washington has been as gay or has had such elaborate preparations for an inauguration as for the inauguration of Herbert Hoover. A galaxy of dances, parties, teas, suppers, musical banquets, receptions, and whatnot makes it impossible to describe sanely the social activity in Washington during this past weekend. Miss Fern Hopkins stepping down from a red Arrow car, wearing a coat trimmed with luxurious linked collar. Miss Grace Kellogg and her charming daughter, Muriel, dashing madly about from engagement to engagement. Miss Sarah Arnold in a blue taffeta gown. Miss George S. Williams arriving at the White House reception with the official family. Politicians in close conversation regarding the Black cabinet. More visitors arriving. They arrived at the Blue Room and enjoyed the dinner at the State Dining Room and sat on the dais during the parade. Noted the Philadelphia Tribune, this was the first time that members of the race have been recipients of social favors since the Roosevelt administration during the time that Booker T. Washington was a frequent visitor and received such signal courtesy. Say, you go, Miss Mamie. You go. Miss Mamie at the White House. You go, Miss Mamie. You go, Miss Mamie. Social gatherings soon ended. The Republican Party executed Hoover's Southern plan to unseat Black leaders and their white supporters. As senior committee person from Georgia, Williams thought the patronage privilege due her. However, Hoover viewed all Southern Black Republican leaders as unsavory and set out to replace them with respectable whites. Williams, who had never been accused of mishandling patronage, wrote letter after letter to President Hoover that her appeals were rebuffed or ignored. In September 1929, Williams visited President Hoover at the White House. Apparently, she had had enough, and she went straight to the White House. The African-American press speculated that the visit centered on her request to handle federal patronage in Georgia. Remaining faithful to the party, Williams refused to reveal what was said during her conference with the president, but the outcome spoke for itself. Instead of granting Williams patronage power, Hoover named a committee of 3 white men to dispense federal jobs in Georgia. The press gave its answer as to why. It said, her record is clean. No taint of corruption can be charged against her. The only reason that can be assigned for no consideration being shown her is that she is colored. Williams, as did other members of the Black and Tan faction, witnessed Hoover's determination to lily white the party. At a banquet of 100 guests at the Stop Lynching League, Williams scolded the president and warned of the downfall of the party if it continued to fail to protect and nourish its Black wing. She warned white leadership was not only impossible, but suicidal and treacherous as it goes against Republican principles. Nevertheless, she reaffirmed her dedication to politics and to the enfranchisement of Black women. She said, to many, politics is a sordid game. Now, my sister is sitting here, and she's a judge. And what she tells me, it is a sordid game. And I don't know why she stays in it, but she loves it. To many, politics is a sordid game, Williams told the audience at the church in New York. But to me, it means getting everything worthwhile out of it for the race. With granting the franchise to women, several million colored women were added to the electorate, and they entered the political world with knowledge gleaned from 60 years' experience in all forms of labor, Williams continued, occupying, as she does, the least favorable position on the economic scale. The colored woman is the first to feel the blunt of unemployment, the first to feel the increase of costs of food. Because of these, she should be interested in politics. Williams did not shy away from the faults of both parties regarding the increase in lynchings in the South. She said, not one voice of protest has come from the head of our government, The entire nation seems to have gone asleep in regards to the heinous crime of lynching. Ensuing ensued upon the state level, pitting Ben Davis and the Lily Whites against Williams and the Black and Tan. So you had a faction within the Republican Party here in Georgia. But she would not be denied. So Williams' group held a delegation where no black people were invited, except for Davis, because that's what Davis was. So Williams came back and she said, well, I'm going to hold a convention that's going to be representative of everybody. So she wanted to make sure that blacks and whites were part of her delegation. And she called the other delegation with the Lily Whites of being nothing more or less than a bunch of tricksters, fake Republicans, and job seekers. So in 1932, Williams took her fight to Chicago to the National Convention, arguing that her faction was the only duly elected delegates and a true representation of the people. No one gave her, the National Committee woman, what she deserved. In her zeal, she spoke over her time. The roar of laughter from the committee room and spectators made it impossible for the chairman's gavel to be heard. Williams appealed to the committee to make their decision 100% American by, quote, putting a little color into it and seating her delegation. Her words fell on deaf ears. The Credentials Committee recognized the Lily White faction. James Arnold White, a former Democrat, and a man once associated with the Ku Klux Klan, was recognized as committee man. And Mrs. Bertha F. Field White of Marietta was nominated to succeed Williams as the National Committee woman. The colors changed. Williams arose when Arnold's name was presented, and in a dramatic and courageous fashion, protested the election as a repudiation of colored membership of the party in this state, and warned the move represented a domination of lily white leaders over the Republicans of the South. The Baltimore African American newspaper wrote, "She stood there in the highest body of the Republican Party like a lone reed in the wilderness, with a vibrant note of sincerity ringing from her voice. She pleaded for recognition of the masses of the party in the South, but not another voice was raised to support her protest." Has anybody been there? Or your backup backs out the door, and you're standing there by yourself, but she stood, and she stood firm. She failed to gain that nomination. She was unseated. She called herself Exhibit A of colored citizens who have been victims of the Republican Party. She also pointed to the president's failure to condemn disenfranchisement, segregation, and discrimination in the governmental departments, and the failure to ensure that colored workers got their quota of jobs of work fostered by the government. So she spoke out for everybody. And by this time, she had had enough. In 1932, at the close of her political career, the Atlanta Daily World thanked Williams for her impeccable service. As a modern Esther pleading for her people, the paper wrote, she knew no compromise, accepted no quarter. Mrs. Williams will go down in history as the champion saint of her people, with her hands unstained and her conscience clear, with the consideration that at no time did temptation in its glaring disguise move her to deliver her people and her party for 30 pieces of silver. So Williams remained a Republican, but she never forgave the Republican Party. In 1940, she conducted an interview, and she discussed her grudge in the following terms. By this time, she was really through. In 1924, she said, "I was elected in my own right as committee woman from Georgia. I was reelected in 1928 and served until 1932. I was the first Republican committee woman from the state of Georgia and the first Negro committee woman in the country. Now, I'm a Republican from principle, and I have always voted the Republican ticket. In 1932, Walter Brown and Herbert Hoover lily-whited the party in Georgia. But they were so busy lily-whiting the party that they didn't know they were permanently kicking themselves out of this country. I have stomped this entire state for the Republican Party, but I wouldn't do it now. I have urged young women to register, vote, and pay their poll taxes regularly, but I wouldn't do it now. It makes me boil when I recall that Ben Davis, a Negro, first sold us out for a mess of pottage. He sold his birthright, but I didn't go quietly. I tell you that now." I'm sure upon defeat, she asked herself, what now? You give yourself to a cause, to an organization, and it kind of turns its back on you. So you have to say, what do I do now? But she picked herself up, and she said, I'm going back to my Savannah community, where I am revered and loved. In 1942, Williams and other prominent African-American leaders met with the leadership of the Girl Scouts here in Savannah. They set forth to establish troops for African-American girls. The women established an executive committee of which Mamie was named a member. The women met with Dr. B.F. Hubert, president of what today is Savannah State University, and identified a community in Hancock County of 10,000 acres of land owned by African Americans, and worked with the Log Cabin Center of Negro Country Life and Association in that committee. Meetings were held with the Savannah Girl Scouts, who visited the site to make sure that the organization, that it met its standards. The Negro Division, Dr. Herbert stressed that Negro women were to be involved in every aspect, including the fundraising for the Girl Scouts facilities, and he selected Mamie George Williams to head that fundraising job. The camp opened in 1945. The Atlanta Constitution announced groundbreaking ceremonies for its log cabin camp and noted it was the nation's first camp for Negro Girl Scouts. Mamie George Williams of Savannah is chairman, and the committee raised $6,000 to finance the project. There you go, Miss Mamie. Go, Miss Mamie. The Girl Scouts camp was a huge success. The 2-week camp offered arts and crafts, swimming in a cement pool, folk dances, outdoor cooking and hiking, exploring trails, nature observances, horseback riding. Teachers volunteered their time, and physicians offered free medical screening. Mamie George Williams continued to serve Savannah. In 1937, she served as president of the Georgia Savings and Realty Corporation, today known as the Carver State Bank. She was later a leader in the membership that established the Colored Recreation Center and Swimming Pool here in Savannah. She helped to establish the Georgia State Training School for Colored Girls and served as a matron in charge of the Chatham Protective Home for Girls in Thunderbolt and as a board member of the Greenbriers Children's Home. Mamie George Williams died in Savannah in 1951. In eulogizing Williams, the editor of the Savannah Tribune wrote of her civic and social contributions and said, in the passing of Mrs. Mamie George S. Williams, Savannah lost another citizen, loyal to it to the core, and a tireless champion of her people. Perhaps none of her activities gave her more satisfaction than the work with the Chatham Protective Home for Negro Girls and her work with Girl Scouts. Many children whom she mothered bear eloquent testimony of the devotion to a cause to which she gave the latter years of her life. Despite her accomplishments, Mamie George Williams has been lost to history, but she's been resurrected. She has been recalled only by a few who have included her in broad works on women and Savannah. She broke down barriers for Black women and white women, becoming the nation's first African-American Republican National Committee woman and the first woman of any race accorded the floor at a Republican National Convention. She battled for African Americans to be heard, counted, and respected in the Republican Party, often standing alone. Hers was a mothering spirit, a voice crying in the wilderness. Although battle-tested, victorious, and often scarred, she never flinched. She never gave in. She aimed in politics to get everything worthwhile out of it for the race. And I often think of Mamie George Williams and other women who are engaged in organizations and causes to which they give so much. And sometimes so much criticism comes back. And sometimes people pick out the little things instead of seeing the big things. And so I often give this song as a dedication to her. May the works I've done speak for me. May the works I've done speak for me. When I've done the best I can, no, nobody understands. Mamie George Williams, champion of her people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that gift to this organization. I didn't tell you all this, but Thelma Fan delayed her return to Atlanta by many, many hours and a night to be with us today. And so we are kind of looking at the clock. She has to get on the road, but there's a little bit of time maybe for some questions before you start to be nervous about the time. Can I bring the microphone to you?
Two small questions. One, does she have any family? Does she have any kids?
She did not have children. She did not. She has extended family, and I'm still looking for them.
Okay.
But way extended.
Second question. She was so prominent. Does anybody know why she disappeared? Why there was nothing said about her in history?
I have no idea. I think because she did not have children to carry on her legacy. That may have been. She died in the 1950s when I think the civil rights struggle was taking on a different kind of mode. And sometimes people who are doing quiet work are just forgotten.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation and the song. You mentioned that there was a commemorative plaque placed yesterday. What's the significance of that location for the plaque?
Okay, so she lived in the area of what is now Dixon Park, which is East Broad Street and East Henry Street, across from the Carnegie Library. She worked in that community, and she also lived in that community. So that is one of the significant pieces. Also, Dixon Park was a segregated park. And in the 20s, the African Americans who lived on 2/3 of the block had to really send a petition to the mayor to allow black children to live there, because the minority white community did not want black children to play there. And so that was another way of saying, and eventually they said, well, it can be a park and colored children can play here, but no one over the age of 12. That was considered a compromise, I guess. So I think it's just fitting that A, it was her community, and B, the marker is there because they didn't want us there.
It seems like the African-American press covered her extensively. I'm gathering that's where most of your quotations come from. Did the Savannah press cover her? Did they follow her in her career?
I'm not sure, because there's a gap in the Savannah newspapers that are not on microfilm. So I'm sure they covered her, but to what extent, I'm not sure. But you are absolutely right. She remains alive because of what the African American newspaper printed. And the Atlanta Journal would print some things because they were the first ones to say, oh, this camp for Girl Scouts, this is probably the first one in the country. Some things they just couldn't ignore. But in terms of just following her life and following her battles, particularly during her political career, the African American newspapers were definitely there.
Thank you for this presentation. I just wanted to ask, is there a biography of her, or are you going to write one, perhaps?
I have about 3 notebooks this size on Mamie George. I know more about her than I know about my own son, who's a rapper and he's pretty popular, but I don't know about it. So I would like to, but you know, I'm a I write books, and the market does this. You know, Walmart, they want everything about African American people. Next time, nobody's really interested. Oh, we love history. Nobody's really interested. But I would want to maybe do something for a journal article so that her story is there. Yes.
Do you mind giving us the titles of 1 or 2 or 3 of your books so that we know what to look for?
Okay, so they're out of print, but you can still find them maybe on Amazon. Some people may have the flagship, which was entitled Lest We Forget, The Passage from Africa to Slavery and Emancipation. And it has documents that you can pull out. Yes, and I know they have it at the Carnegie Library. That was followed by Freedom's Children, which talks about Reconstruction, which nobody even today wants to talk about Reconstruction. We Shall Not Be Moved, which is the Civil Rights Journey. And then I did a book with a CD in the back called No Man Can Hinder Me, which gives our spirituals and just talks about, even in the darkest hours, we had faith and we had community. And I think those are the ones. But you can find me under Velma Maia Thomas, and just Google my name and the books will pop up.
That's good. I have another question, but I want to give the audience a chance before I ask the second question. I'm interested in the shift in politics. I associate the exodus of African Americans from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party more with the civil rights era, but clearly this was already happening in the 1920s and the 1930s. So I'm curious to know if you have a sense, whether it be Mamie Williams or African Americans in the South writ large, were they wooed or swayed even remotely by what I perceive to be fairly progressive ideas of Eleanor Roosevelt during the FDR administration? Or was, I mean, she was clearly put out with the Republicans by 1940.
Right.
But
they started to move away after Hoover. I think it had a lot to do with the African American voting bloc in the North. And they were saying, if you're mistreating black people in the South, it won't be but a minute before you start to mistreat us. And so then they really started to move away from that and to begin to vote on the Republican Party. I'm sorry, the Democratic Party side.
Because what I understand about anti-lynching laws and so on is the FDR knew that was a non-starter with Southern Democrats. But Eleanor was kind of outspoken about that. And she wished, I think, from what I've read, she wished that her husband would have taken that on with Congress and with the Senate, even though he didn't.
Nobody wanted to touch that. It failed twice. And sometimes, I guess, those kind of conversations, people want to say, well, let's leave to the next administration.
Kick it down the sidewalk.
And you kick it, and you kick it down, and you kick it down, and you kick it down, and 100 years later, you have a president who finally says, okay, and a Congress that finally says, let's pass an anti-lynching bill. But it took 100 years. Because nobody wanted to lose a vote over being right. Make
sure this audience knows when that finally happened.
Oh,
you
that
said,
was it last
yesterday.
Year?
Yeah, it was in 2021, I think.
Yeah, with
I'm going only on what I heard you say yesterday, but check my facts.
Yeah, it was recent.
It was remarkably recently.
This last, under the Biden March 29, 2022, President Joe Biden signed into law the Emmett-Till Anti-Lynching Act of 2022. It is a bill that makes lynching a federal hate crime. It took more than 100 years for Congress to pass such a bill. The Dyer anti-lynching bill was introduced in Congress in 1918. The Dyer bill was ultimately defeated by Southern Democrat filibuster December 1922, and twice more after there, and by Republicans who conveniently missed the opportunity to vote.
Janet.
Just a question about her name, Mamie George Williams. Now, her husband is George Williams, right?
Right.
So this is sort of like Mrs. George Williams,
right,
but it's her first name. That's kind of odd, it seems to me, to have, because she lost her own name, right? You said she was Miller.
Yeah.
Is that right? she gave that, so she's not Mamie Miller Williams.
No, her husband. Okay, so let's go back to 1920s. When we didn't have first names, yes. We had our husband's names. You were Mrs. whomever you married. And I guess she followed in that tradition. And she, Mrs. Mamie George Williams, and sometimes Mamie George S. Williams. But eventually she did keep her Miller name, and that's a whole nother story that I'm just going to hold off on. But I was surprised because I had to look for her name all kind of ways. And when I dropped the S, somebody's going to have to look for it all kind of ways. But that was where she was prominent because of her husband at first, because he was well known. And because of the times and because of traditions, she remained Mrs. whomever you marry.
So did he support her in her political activity?
Well, he died in 1915, a little early. And she really got started around 1919, and a little earlier. But I think he knew she was a firebrand when he married her. So I'm sure he would have supported her because he was a trailblazer.
Do you have the sense that her widowhood maybe freed her to be as active as she was? I wonder if her story would have been different had she been married. Maybe you can't know that, I guess, but.
It probably did so that she could travel and be who she wanted to be. But I think even if she did not get involved in politics, she would have remained in the community and helping African-American girls.
Here's another probably unfair what-if question. Do you think that she would have been as able to be as effective as she was if she had had darker skin? Do you think that she was able to move in circles because of her complexion that might have been more difficult otherwise?
I would say no. I think African American women, because, you know, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, you know, we stood before us as who we were. And we understood why she was fair-skinned. You know? Yeah.
Right.
And so when we look at ourselves, we see our history right there in front of us, all hues, and we all go, I know what happened there. So they stood on the ground of, what do you believe in? Are you for us? Are you with us in this march? And if so, come on, because you are a sister in our struggle.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Yes, let me come.
Could you clarify the Lily White Republicans, what that was?
Okay. So it was not a legal, or it was more of a community name or a cultural that African Americans applied. So the Lily Whites were those who said, we want the Republican Party to be rid of black leadership. We wanted Lily White, white like a lily white. The opposing faction has been known as the Black and Tans, and I've seen two explanations for that. African Americans are black people, and they're white contemporaries. There were some white people who said, okay, we're going to make sure the Republican Party represents everybody. And then there were some that said they were black and tans because African Americans, as we said, were all hues and colors. But they were two different groups that had two different ideologies as to what the Republican Party could look like. And the Lily Whites won. And we said, okay, we're going to go to the Democratic Party.
That's helpful to understand. Ann, I'll come back to you.
What percentage of the Republicans were black at that time?
I would say a small percentage in the South, but in the North, that was still the primary party.
So they weren't. So the Republican Party as a whole wasn't concerned about losing a lot of folks?
No, in the South, they were concerned about gaining more white people. And it kind of backfired on them. Because the black Republicans said, you're mistreating our people in the South. And so we're going to vote for the Democratic Party. We're going to move away. We're going to say, Republicans, we've been Republicans since Lincoln. And you're still mistreating us. As loyal as we are, you're still mistreating us.
I'm surprised that they were surprised by that.
You know, loyalties are hard to break sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to change. But she saw it coming, and she said, if you don't change the way you're running this Republican Party, you'll be out of politics as far as African Americans are concerned. And she was correct.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, you've given us a tremendous gift today. Thank you very, very much for being with us. Thank you all for coming as well.